There is a night in February 1962 that people who were in the audience at Covent Garden have never quite stopped talking about. A 42-year-old ballerina walked out onto the stage, partnered a 24-year-old Russian defector, and by the time the curtain fell, the entire building was on its feet. That was Margot Fonteyn. And that night was only the beginning of the second half of her life. But her story doesn't quite fit the shape of a triumph. Because while the world watched her become a legend, something else was quietly happening offstage. A husband the establishment found deeply alarming. A revolution on a shrimp boat, a gunshot, and a remote cattle ranch at the end of an unnamed road in Panama. By the time she died, she was considered one of the greatest dancers who ever lived. She was also nearly penniless and had spent the last 25 years of her career dancing not for love of the stage but to pay someone else's bills. Segment 7, The Girl from Reigate Who Became a Legend. Margaret Evelyn Hookham was born on May 18, 1919 in Reigate, Surrey. Her father, Felix Hookham, was a mechanical engineer, quietly British and steady in the way that certain men of that era were steady. Her mother, Hilda, was something more complicated. The daughter of an Irish mother and a Brazilian father, a woman with a gift for seeing what her daughter might become, and a determination to make it happen. Hilda started Margot on ballet lessons at the age of 4 in a small dance school in Elling. It was not, by the standards of the time, an unusual thing to do with a girl child. What was unusual was the girl herself. There was something in the way she moved, a stillness between movements, a quality of listening with her body that her teachers noticed before she was old enough to understand what they were noticing. When Margot was 8, her father accepted a position as chief engineer of a tobacco company in China and the family moved to Shanghai. Margot continued her lessons there under a Russian expatriate named George Goncharov, a teacher who had trained in the great Russian tradition and who understood what he was looking at. He pushed her. She learned to inhabit the kind of discipline that most children her age could not have imagined. She was 14 when her mother brought her back to London, not to go to school in any conventional sense, but to build a career. Hilda enrolled her with Serafina Astaffa, one of the finest teachers then working in London. And shortly afterward, Margot joined the Vic Wells Ballet School, the institution that would eventually become the Royal Ballet, at the invitation of its founder, Dame Nanette de Valois. De Valois had a reputation for spotting talent at a distance and for investing in it with a patience that could look to outsiders like stubbornness. Margot's debut with the company came in when she danced as a snowflake in The Nutcracker. She was 15. The following year, the company's reigning ballerina, Alicia Morova, left and a cascade of leading roles opened up. Margot stepped into them. She danced Giselle. She danced Aurora in The Sleeping Beauty. She danced Odette and Odile in Swan Lake. Critics who had followed Morova's career and assumed no one could replace her began to revise their opinions. By 1939, she was 20 years old and was the company's undisputed star. The name she danced under, Margot Fonteyn, had been constructed from a variation of her Brazilian grandfather's surname, Fontes, chosen because it sounded, as one account put it, appropriately continental for a ballerina. Her mother had written to relatives asking permission to use the original family name, but was refused. Hilda looked through a telephone directory, found Fonteyn, adjusted the spelling slightly, and that became the name that would eventually appear on programs in the world's greatest opera houses. The war years were grueling in ways that are easy to underestimate now. The Sadler's Wells Theatre was turned into an air raid shelter when the Blitz began in September 1940, and the company was sent on tour across England, performing sometimes 3 to 4 times more often than their usual schedule, simply because there was a need, and they were there to fill it. Margot danced through all of it. She was in the Netherlands when Germany invaded in May 1940 and escaped back to England with nothing more than the costume she was wearing. She performed nightly in theaters that sometimes had bomb damage in the surrounding streets for audiences of soldiers and factory workers who were using an evening at the ballet as a form of resistance against the idea that nothing beautiful could survive. After the war, British ballet was no longer regarded as an inferior product. Margot was a significant reason for that shift. In 1949, the company toured America for the first time. The Sleeping Beauty at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York received 48 curtain calls. Critics who had arrived expecting a polished but essentially provincial art form left having reconsidered entirely. Margot Fonteyn was at 30 years old an international celebrity. She was appointed Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1956. She became President of the Royal Academy of Dancing in 1954. Sir Frederick Ashton, the company's choreographer, created roles specifically for her on Daphne's and Chloe symphonic variations. Roles that seemed to be written in the particular grammar of her body. By the early 1950s, there was a broad assumption in the ballet world that Margot Fonteyn was approaching the natural end of her performing career. Ballerinas did not typically sustain careers at the highest level much past their mid-30s, and Margot was already 35 when she did something that surprised almost everyone who knew her. She got married, and the man she married was not the safe, predictable choice that the people in her life had perhaps hoped for. He was charming, well-connected, and spectacularly unsuited to anything resembling a quiet life. Understanding who Tito Aris was is essential to understanding everything that came after. Segment 6, Roberto Tito Aris, the charming complication. Roberto Emilio Aris was born in Panama on October 26, 1918 into a family that occupied the top of Panamanian political life in the way that certain dynasties in small nations tend to comprehensively almost hereditably. His father, Hermodio Arias, had served as president of Panama. His uncle Arnulfo Arias had also been president. Tito himself was educated at the Petty School in New Jersey and then at St. John's College, Cambridge, which is where Margot first encountered him in the late 1930s. He was 19. She was about the same age. They danced together at a party, and something was registered on both sides, though neither acted on it. What Tito became over the following years was a man of extraordinary surface appeal and rather more turbulent depths. He edited his family's newspaper, Lahore, through the 1940s. He served as a diplomat and eventually as Panama's ambassador to the United Kingdom. He was tall, well-dressed, socially effortless, and possessed of the kind of easy confidence that comes from growing up in a family that has always been powerful. He was also, by multiple accounts, a compulsive womanizer, a man who could be deeply attentive to a woman, and almost simultaneously arranging to be somewhere else entirely. When Tito re-encountered Margot in the early 1950s, he had already been married once, had 3 children from that first marriage, and was in the process of extracting himself from it. He had encountered her again on a tour she was making, and even before his divorce was finalized, began pursuing her with the same focused energy he applied to everything else that interested him. He reportedly asked her to marry him at their very first meeting during that tour. She did not agree immediately. The courtship took years. Margot was not naive. She was aware of his reputation, but he was persistent, and there was something about him she found genuinely compelling. The combination of political significance and personal recklessness, the Cambridge education won lightly, the ease with which he moved between worlds. It was a kind of glamour entirely unlike anything the Royal Ballet had ever offered her. The people who knew Margot during this period describe a woman who was for the first time in her adult life genuinely uncertain. Her entire existence up to that point had been organized around certainty. The certainty of the next rehearsal, the next production, the next tour. Tito was the opposite of certainty. He was diverting and dangerous and thoroughly uncontainable. She said yes. On February 6, 1955 in Paris, they were married. Margot was 35. She had spent her entire adult life up to that point in the contained world of the Royal Ballet, rehearsal rooms, stages, dressing rooms, tours. She had been devoted to her art in the way that certain people are devoted to a calling that doesn't leave much room for anything else. Tito represented a different kind of life entirely. Diplomatic receptions, political conversations, travel between continents, a world of influence and risk that was entirely unlike anything she had known. He was appointed Panama's ambassador to the United Kingdom after their marriage, and Margot took on the role of ambassador's wife alongside her continued dancing. The contrast between the two halves of her life in this period is striking. By day or at night, she was on stage at Covent Garden. Between engagements, she was hosting diplomatic dinners in London, accompanying her husband to official functions, learning to operate in a world where the social currency was political connection rather than artistic reputation. The marriage was happy intermittently. Tito was affectionate when he was present and largely unavailable when he wasn't. His infidelities were not particularly well conceded. There were women who moved through his life with a regularity that was difficult to overlook. Among them was a Panamanian socialite named Annabella Ballerina, who by multiple accounts functioned as a shadow presence in Tito's life for years, appearing when Margot was away on tour and disappearing before her return. Margot absorbed this without the public eruptions that a different woman might have produced. Her close friends noted that she appeared to have made a choice to love Tito on terms that included his limitations, and to have made it with the same disciplined clarity she brought to everything else she undertook. She probably did not foresee 1959, but 1959 was coming regardless, because Tito Arias was not merely a diplomat with complicated personal habits. He was also a man who had twice attempted to overthrow the government of his own country. And in 1959, he tried again. This time he took his wife with him. Segment 5, The Revolution on the Shrimp Boat. In January 1959, the political landscape of Latin America had just been upended. Fidel Castro had come to power in Cuba at the beginning of the year, and the effect on the rest of the region was immediate and electric. Across Central and South America, men with political ambitions and access to certain kinds of support began to recalibrate their calculations. Tito Arias was one of them. He had resigned as Panama's ambassador to Britain in 1958 following a falling out with President Ernesto de Guardia Jr. By early 1959 he had arranged a meeting with Castro in Havana and secured support, men, arms, and the general blessing of the Cuban revolutionary government for what he planned to describe as a nationalist uprising against the Panamanian government. Margot knew about it. She was not a passive bystander. British government documents declassified in 2010 confirmed that Fonteyn was herself complicit in the operation, not reluctantly swept along, but actively aware of and involved in what her husband was planning. She had confessed as much to the British ambassador to Panama during a prison visit, and the Foreign Office agreed to keep her statement confidential. The operation itself when it came was something between a military action and a farce. On April 26, 1959, Tito and Margot went out on the yacht, the Nola, ostensibly for a fishing trip. The real purpose was to rendezvous with a supply vessel loaded with weapons. When local fishermen noticed what was happening and reported it, the whole scheme began to unravel almost immediately. Tito attempted to transfer to a shrimp boat called the Elaine to escape. Margot stayed with the yacht and used it as a decoy before eventually surrendering to authorities. She spent the night in a Panamanian jail. She was deported to New York the following day after 24 hours in custody. The deported ballerina, the world's most famous dancer, photographed in the custody of Panamanian officials. The images ran in newspapers from London to Buenos Aires. Tito fled to the Brazilian embassy and was eventually allowed to leave the country. The armed force he had assembled, backed by Cuban troops who had landed separately on the Panamanian coast, was quickly overwhelmed by the Panamanian National Guard with American support. 87 invaders surrendered in early May and were repatriated to Cuba. The charges against Tito and Margot were eventually dropped. They returned to Panama. Tito was reappointed as ambassador to Britain in 1960. A development that says something about the particular dynamics of Panamanian political life that the man who had just attempted a coup could be back in a diplomatic role within the year. In Britain, the scandal had a complicated reception. There were people who found the whole episode disqualifying. A prima ballerina, a dame of the British Empire, caught on a boat loaded with arms, involved in a coup attempt against a friendly government. There were others who, perhaps unfairly, found it faintly romantic. The press accounts of the time described her as loyal, as devoted, as the kind of woman who stood by her man, even when her man's plans were shambolic. The more frank assessment, which not everyone was ready to voice, was that Margot Fonteyn had allowed her husband to draw her into something that could have ended her career, her freedom, and quite possibly her life, and that she had done so with her eyes open. The ballet world held its breath. And then Margot got back on stage because what else would she do? But the 1959 revolution, for all its drama, was not the moment that changed Margot Fonteyn's life most permanently. That moment came 5 years later, and it came from a single gunshot. Segment 4, the shot that echoed for 25 years. By 1964, Tito Arias had rebuilt his political career. He stood for election to the National Assembly of Panama and won. His profile remained high, partly because of his own considerable charm and partly, it must be acknowledged, because being married to Dame Margot Fonteyn gave him a cultural cash that no purely Panamanian politician could easily match. She was a genuine international figure. He moved through the world partly in her reflected light. On June 8, 1964, a few weeks after his election, and before he had even taken his seat in the assembly, Tito Arias was shot 5 times by a man named Alfredo Jimenez, a former political associate. The motive was not entirely clear in public. Accounts at the time described it as politically motivated, though the circumstances were widely understood to involve more complicated private grievances. Arias was hit multiple times. He survived, but the damage to his spinal cord was catastrophic. He was left a quadriplegic, unable to walk, unable to speak clearly, dependent on constant care for the rest of his life. Margot was in London when it happened. She flew to Panama immediately and within days had arranged for Tito to be transported to the National Spinal Injuries Centre at Stoke Mandeville Hospital in England, where she supervised his rehabilitation personally. She would rise before 6 o'clock in the morning, travel to the hospital to oversee his care, and then catch a train to London for rehearsals before returning to the hospital at night. Within 2 weeks of the shooting, she was back on stage. Not because she had recovered from the shock, not because the emotional weight of what had happened had lifted, but because she needed the money, because the medical bills for a quadriplegic husband requiring constant specialist care and ongoing rehabilitation were enormous, and Margot Fonteyn was the person who was going to pay them. The National Spinal Injuries Centre at Stoke Mandeville was among the finest facilities in the world for what Tito needed. But that level of care had a cost. There was no family fortune to draw on. There was only her. Over the following months, she maintained a schedule that most people half her age would have found impossible. She would travel to the hospital at first light, spend the early morning hours overseeing Tito's therapy, take a train to London for rehearsals or performances, and return to the hospital at night. She was in her mid-40s. She was dancing on a foot that had developed arthritis. She was also by every account giving performances during this period that ranked among the finest of her career, as though the pressure of what was happening offstage was somehow being channeled into an intensity on stage that she had not had access to before, and she paid them for the next 25 years. The woman who had planned by her own account to stop performing at 35 danced until she was 60. The title of Prima Ballerina Assoluta, bestowed on her by the Royal Ballet in 1979, the year of her retirement, was an honor genuinely earned. But the reason she kept dancing that long was not purely artistic ambition. It was a set of medical bills and a husband in a wheelchair, and the stubborn refusal to stop doing the one thing she knew how to do. There is a detail from these years that those who knew the situation well have mentioned repeatedly. During Margot's absences on tour, Annabella Vallerino, the woman who had been part of Tito's life for years, would move back into the household. She would leave again before Margot returned. This arrangement continued even after Tito's injury. Margot was aware of it. She said nothing publicly. Whatever private accommodation she had made with this fact, she kept to herself. She took Tito with her on tour when she could. She spoke for him when he could not speak clearly for himself. She pushed his wheelchair through the corridors of government buildings in Panama City. In 1967, she was photographed doing exactly that as Tito took his seat in the National Assembly. 3 years after the shooting, having been elected and unable to take his place until that day, every member of the Assembly stood and applauded when he entered. Margot's loyalty to Tito in this period was by any reasonable measure extraordinary. Whether it was also freely chosen or whether it was the loyalty of a woman who had made a commitment and was not the kind of person to break it regardless of the cost. That question has been asked many times and has never been satisfactorily answered. And through all of this, the revolution, the shooting, the bills, the wheelchair, the other woman, something was happening on stage that was completely at odds with the private circumstances of Margot Fonteyn's life. Because in 1962, while her marriage was already complicated and her husband's ambitions were already causing trouble, she walked out onto a stage in London with a young Russian named Rudolf Nureyev and everything changed. Segment 3, Nureyev, the partnership that redefined everything. In June 1961, Rudolf Nureyev was performing with the Karaoke Ballet at Labour Airport in Paris when during a layover he stepped away from his Soviet handlers and requested asylum from the French authorities. He was 23 years old from a Tatar family in the Ural Mountains of Russia, and he was already being described by those who had seen him dance as the most extraordinary male ballet dancer alive. His defection was an international news event. It coincided with a Cold War moment when the movement of individuals between East and West carried enormous symbolic weight, and a Soviet dancer choosing freedom over the Kira was exactly the kind of story that newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic handled with great seriousness. The moment Nureyev defected, he became exactly the kind of figure that the Western cultural world found irresistible. Young, unruly, brilliantly talented, genuinely dangerous in the sense that beautiful, unpredictable things are dangerous. He was not easy to manage. He was physically volcanic on stage, technically stunning, and personally almost impossible to contain. His ego was considerable and his sense of personal rules was minimal. He had learned to survive in a system that did not reward individuality. And having escaped it, he intended to be as individual as possible. Ballet companies across Europe and America competed for his attention. He gave it briefly to several of them. Nanette de Valois invited him to dance with the Royal Ballet, and she invited him to dance with Margot Fonteyn. Margot had reservations. She was 42, he was 23. The age gap was not merely a social awkwardness, but a genuine question about whether the pairing would work in any artistic sense, whether two bodies trained in such different ways, shaped by such different experiences, could find a common language. She agreed to try, and on February 21, 1962, they danced Giselle together at Covent Garden. The audience had come curious and left converted. At the curtain calls, Nureyev dropped to one knee on the stage and kissed Fonteyn's hand. The building did not stop applauding for 20 curtain calls. The press reached for the word historic and could not find a better one. What Nureyev did for Fonteyn and what she did for him was something that nobody had quite anticipated. His physical energy and wildness pulled something out of her that the more controlled world of British classical ballet had not fully released. Her musicality and precision gave his extraordinary technique a grounding and a shape. Together they were, as Fonteyn's biographer later put it, operating at a level that most dancers never approach. The gap in their ages, rather than being the problem it might have been, became part of the drama. The experienced and the incandescent finding the same thing in the music at the same moment. Sir Frederick Ashton choreographed Marguerite and Armand specifically for them in 1963. A work so closely associated with their particular chemistry that no other couple danced it until the 21st century. In 1965, they premiered Kenneth Macmillan's Romeo and Juliet at Covent Garden on February 9. Macmillan had originally conceived the ballet for Lynn Seymour and Christopher Gable, but the opera house management overruled him and assigned the premiere to Fonteyn and Nureyev. Macmillan was furious. The audience was rapturous. They took 43 curtain calls. Eventually, the safety curtain had to be lowered to encourage the audience to leave the building. The partnership lasted until Fonteyn's retirement in 1979, 17 years in total. Offstage, they were close in ways that generated considerable speculation. Nureyev said in at least one documentary that there had been a physical relationship between them. Fonteyn denied it. Her biographer, Meredith Deman, reviewed the available evidence and came down tentatively on Nureyev's side, though without certainty. What nobody disputed was the depth of the bond itself, the mutual protectiveness, the loyalty that survived everything, including the long stretches of Fonteyn's life when she was in Panama and he was on a stage somewhere else. In 1967, they were arrested together in San Francisco after police raided a party in Haight-Ashbury that they had attended after a performance. The charges were dropped. The photographs of them in the aftermath circulated widely and seemed to belong to an entirely different story than the one that most people associated with the composed and elegant Dame Margot Fonteyn. She was 48 years old. She was also by this point funding a level of international touring that was directly driven by the cost of her husband's care. The partnership with Nuriv extended her earning years. It is not a comfortable fact, but it is a true one. Without Tito's medical bills, the Fonteyn-Nuriv partnership might have ended several years earlier than it did. Eventually, even the most extraordinary career reaches its end. When Margot Fonteyn finally left the stage in 1979, she did not retire to comfort or security. She retired to a cattle ranch on an unnamed road in western Panama, where she would spend the final decade of her life in circumstances that most people who had watched her dance would have found very difficult to recognize. Segment 2, The Ranch at El Higo. The village of El Higo is about 60 miles southwest of Panama City. Getting there from the main highway requires turning onto a route unpaved road that at the time Margot Fonteyn lived on it had no name. The farmhouse at the end of that road also had no telephone. The woman who had danced before kings and received standing ovations in New York, London, Paris, and Moscow lived there with 400 head of cattle, 5 dogs, and her paralyzed husband. She had retired from performing in 1979 at 60 when the Royal Ballet honored her with the title Prima Ballerina Assolut, a distinction given to only 3 ballerinas in the 20th century. It was an evening that those who attended described as genuinely moving. She danced a duet with Frederick Ashton and a tango with her old partner Robert Helpman. The audience knew they were watching the end of something irreplaceable. They behaved accordingly. After that she went to Panama. What she found there was not the gracious retirement of a celebrated artist. The medical care Tito required was expensive and continuous. The finances were consistently strained. Tito himself was difficult, restless, despite his physical limitations, given to deciding without notice that he wished to travel to another country, and requiring elaborate and costly arrangements to make that possible. Margot, by all accounts, managed all of it without complaint. She had made her choice and she kept it. There was something that several of those close to her noted with a certain careful phrasing that for all the obvious cost of her devotion to Tito, she had also found in his dependence on her something that she needed. She had spent her entire life being the one who was watched, evaluated, judged by the angle of her line and the precision of her timing. In Panama, she was simply the person who looked after things. A friend who visited her in those years described a woman who appeared, despite everything, to be at peace in a way she had not always seemed on stage. She raised cattle. She wrote her autobiography. She coached young dancers when companies invited her, occasionally flying to New York or London to work with American Ballet Theatre or the Royal Ballet and then returning to Panama with the same quiet purposefulness with which she did everything. She hosted the occasional visitor. Nuriv came when he could despite his own relentlessly packed schedule as both a performer and from 1983 the director of the Paris Opera Ballet. They spoke by phone several times a week, which required Margot to drive to the nearest telephone and Nuriv to call at an agreed time from wherever he happened to be. The friendship that had started on a stage in 1962 was, if anything, deeper in these years than it had been in the middle of their performing partnership. She had described him publicly as the person who had given her a second career. He described her privately and publicly as essential to everything he had become in the West. Tito died on November 22, 1989. On the same day, Annabella Vallerino, the woman who had been part of his life for decades, took her own life. The two were buried on the same day. Margot had been diagnosed with cancer shortly before Tito's death. She did not go public with the diagnosis immediately. When word spread, the response from the ballet world was immediate. In May 1990, a gala was held at Covent Garden to raise money for her care. Placido Domingo volunteered to sing. Nerf danced despite his own deteriorating health. He had been HIV positive for some years by this point and was managing his illness as carefully as he could while maintaining a schedule that would have defeated most healthy people. More than 2,000 people attended the event, including Princess Margaret, Diana, Princess of Wales, and Nanette de Valois. The evening raised $250,000 for a trust fund for Fonteyn's support. Nureyev also paid a substantial portion of her medical bills directly in private without fanfare. She spent the final months of her life in hospital, first in Houston, then in Panama City. Shortly before her death, she converted to Roman Catholicism so that her ashes could be buried in the same tomb as Tito's. She died on February 21, 1991 in a hospital in Panama City. She was 71 years old. The date was the 29th anniversary of her first performance with Nureyev in Gazelle at Covent Garden in 1962. Nureyev, who was by then seriously ill himself, was unable to attend either the burial in Panama or the memorial service at Westminster Abbey in London on July 2, 1991. He died of AIDS on January 6, 1993, less than 2 years after Margot. What Margot Fonteyn left behind was a legacy in the art of ballet that remains more than 30 years after her death, genuinely difficult to equal. But the life she actually lived was far stranger and harder and in its own way more interesting than the legend. Segment 1: What she left behind. The official story of Margot Fonteyn is easy to summarize. Greatest ballerina of her generation, defined British ballet, formed one of the most celebrated partnerships in the history of dance. Dame of the British Empire. Prima ballerina assoluta, a woman who received 48 curtain calls in New York at 30, 43 curtain calls in London at 45, and the formal designation as the finest classical dancer of her century at 60. A career that by every metric applied to careers was without peer. All of that is true. The other story, the one that runs underneath it, is about a woman who made a choice in her mid-30s that most people who cared about her thought was a mistake, and who then spent the rest of her life living inside that choice with a consistency that was either profound devotion or profound stubbornness, depending on who you asked and when you asked them. Tito Arias was, by any objective measure, a complicated man to have loved. He was unfaithful throughout their marriage. He involved her in a coup attempt that resulted in her arrest and public humiliation. He was shot by a political rival and left unable to speak or walk, requiring round-the-clock care for 25 years. The woman who paid for that care was Margot Fonteyn, dancing well past the point when her arthritic foot was causing her genuine pain at every performance, simply because the alternative was not keeping her promises. There is a particular kind of choice that appears romantic from the outside and looks very different from the inside, and Fonteyn's marriage to Arias was perhaps one of those. But there is also something in the way those who knew her described the later years in Panama: the cattle, the dogs, the afternoon drives to the telephone, the visits from Nureyev. That does not read like a woman who felt she had made the wrong decision. She had made a decision and she lived it completely, which is not quite the same thing. The Fonteyn-Nureyev partnership remains the reference point against which all other ballet partnerships are measured. The 43 curtain calls for Romeo and Juliet. The night in 1962 when Nureyev knelt and kissed her hand and the audience understood in real time that they were watching something that would not come again. The way that Margot Fonteyn at 42 discovered new dimensions of her own artistry because a 23-year-old Russian defector had arrived and refused to accept that she was finished. The title Prima Ballerina Assoluta was given to only 3 dancers in the 20th century. Fonteyn was the last. She was 60 years old when she received it. And the only reason she was still dancing at 60 was Tito's medical bills. So in a way, the marriage that many people considered a ruin contributed directly to the career distinction that has never been matched. Her estate at the time of her death was modest. The years of dancing had supported not her own retirement, but someone else's care. She died in a hospital in the country where her husband had been buried 2 years earlier on the anniversary of the night she had first danced with Nureyev, having converted to Roman Catholicism, so she could share his tomb. She left behind a body of work that people are still watching. Film recordings of her performances have a quality that is rare, a sense watching them that the person on screen understood not just what they were doing, but why it mattered. She gave the ballet world everything she had, and she gave most of everything else to a man who had given her a life she could not have predicted and would not, by all available evidence, have traded. It is a story about the highest possible achievement in one arena and a decision made once and held without revision for 35 years in another. Both things are real. Neither cancels out the other. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.